Hey everyone, Paul here, and I want to walk through Workday stock because on Friday, November 20th, 2020, they were one of the biggest losers within the Nasdaq indice. So I want to do a few different things here. I want to kind of take a look at their performance over the past 5 years, look at that in relation to the performance of the Nasdaq, and then kind of look at some shorter term correlations as well. I think we're going to have some interesting insights that could lead to some interesting shorter term trades with these. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we look at this together again over the past 5 years. We look for the first few years, with the Workday being in blue here, Nasdaq Composite being in this yellow-orange color we're seeing. But for the first few years, they were kind of running together, and after a couple years, Workday, was starting to outperform. But really, by in looking at the past 5 years. In late 2018, Workday started to run much higher than what the Nasdaq was performing, and that proved to be relatively short-lived because we can kind of see that in 2019 that Workday was starting to kind of come back closer to what the average Nasdaq performance was, and then ultimately in early 2020 and March 2020 with a crash, they actually fell down below where the Nasdaq Composite was. And then when we look most recently again, we can see this one-day performance, that 9% drop on Friday, and that came with the Nasdaq for that same day down just 0.42%. So the Nasdaq was relatively flat. And when we narrow our time horizon down here, so when we look at this just in the past year, what becomes kind of interesting was that, we see that for the most part, for the past year that Workday has been underperforming the NASDAQ, and that when it briefly actually just in August, late August, ran up above and started to outperform the NASDAQ, it immediately pulled back, and that ended up not being true for very long. So with that in mind, what we also see here is that there's been a pretty big divergence between the Nasdaq and Workday here within the past couple weeks. And again, it was really noticeable with that decline. And so kind of noting the fact that this has actually been pretty well correlated, and that, anytime that Workday has kind of ran above recently the NASDAQ trend here, that it's kind of corrected in the opposite direction and vice versa. I think it could be an interesting opportunity to look at Workday as a short-term trade, to buy Workday while either buying puts against the NASDAQ kind of ETF or something that tracks the NASDAQ performance, or just outright shorting that ETF. And what that does is that, essentially, if you put yourself in a situation where you do actually think this gap is going to narrow a little bit, kind of as we head into the week or the next few weeks, if you think the gap is going to narrow, it puts you in a situation where by buying Workday but then shorting the NASDAQ, if Workday's falling just because of general market sentiment, so let's say that the NASDAQ and Workday both fell by 10%, they would cancel each other out. So, but conversely, if you saw Workday recover by 5%, while the NASDAQ again was relatively flat or maybe down by 1%, then you'd be able to collect on that difference. So just kind of an interesting way to kind of walk through and take a look at the performance of this stock, and saying that, hey, it was running way above, it narrowed that gap within the last year, and it's been underperforming the NASDAQ. And again, most recently, I think you could make a case that maybe Workday has become a little bit too bearish relative to the NASDAQ index. So again, I thought this could be an interesting analysis to walk through. I would love to know what your comments are, thoughts, if you're investing in Workday for the long term, if you would have any interest in doing a trade like this. Of course, if you do your own research and make sure that it fits your own financial goals prior to executing anything. But I will see you next video.